Hello everyone, and this is the panel to discuss Ishinomori Shotaro, the king of manga, titled such more than because the fandom for the longest time have regarded him as such, while Osamu Tezuka himself is considered the god of manga. Ishinomori is often considered the king of manga because unlike Osamu Tezuka, his mentor, Ishinomori went on to win the Guinness World Records of the most comics published by one artist in his lifetime, a reputation, and has a very credible creative reputation equatable to the likes of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko of Marvel Comics here in the States. He is also a very inspirational, influential figure in the art and the medium, both for manga as well as live-action tokusatsu, which is Japanese special effects superhero programs, and ultimately that has had its own ripple effect on designs and inspirations for anime and video games. Ishinomori was born in the 1930s, and he got started as early as his grade school years up until high school, when he started submitting some of his own works to a major publisher, which was how he got recognition from Tezuka, who personally invited him to be his assistant. He accepted after finishing his midterms at the time. So he actually got to do some work on Tetsuan Atom, which the West knows better as Astro Boy. There are actually some specific chapters of the manga itself that you could read that basically describe Ishinomori's time working under Tezuka. I just can't remember it offhand, but that's a good example of work. Another piece of work that he's had exposure for was actually from the 1990s, because back then Nintendo Power wanted to publish a comic on the then recently released Zelda game for the Super Nintendo, A Link to the Past, and Ishinomori himself got to be the artist for that comic. And it was famously serialized throughout the entire year from 1992 to 1993. It then got published into an anthology that you can now readily find on places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble in its completion. And you can see some of the immediate design cues and influences from Ishinomori's work. He's always had a peculiar aesthetic based around just this large macro scale drawing, which, depending on the scene, the context, and what's all happening, it's like the literal statement of every picture's 1,000 words, then anything Ishinomori draws might as well be a million words. The most apt way for me to describe it. And another theme behind Ishinomori's work has always been the idea of his characters who are superheroes who struggle with their identity and how their powers define them as being beyond humanity, and yet they wish to be able to retain and see themselves as human, as we will see with a lot of examples. The first and most prominent example would of course be Kamen Ranger, or Masked Rider, which began as a softer idea for a previous work Ishinomori worked on of an anti-hero who wore a mask in the shape of a skull, who had a vendetta, not unlike Batman.
Skull Rider.
But when Toei wanted to contact Ishinomori with the intention to produce a show based on his manga, they had decided that the Skullman was just a little too gruesome, a little too terrifying of a story for children. So the idea eventually came, he then retweaked the design, and the Skullman became Kamen Rider, which changed the design of a large skull helmet to suddenly a large helmet with compound eyes, like a grasshopper, which is why there's always been this underlying insect motif with Kamen Rider for the longest time while Ishinomori was alive, and sometimes here and thereafter. One of his other greatest works that could be considered that is second only to Rider, but also iconic for Japanese culture, is Cyborg 009, which was produced in 1963, only not too long after Marvel Comics published their first issue of The Avengers. Which is interesting because, well, I had to look this up but chronologically speaking, DC's Justice League predates Marvel's Avengers, but regardless, 009 was Japan's first superhero team. And the story does stand the test of time, considering it is essentially a period piece set during the Cold War. Another major trope of Ishinomori's work is that the villains are typically this overarching large criminal syndicate or evil organization with megalomaniacal intentions.
悪の組織世界征服
In the case of 009, Black Ghost was a collective cabal of individuals within the military-industrial complex that sought to escalate war beyond nuclear weapons. Their idea? Create cyborg soldiers. Soldiers that could survive and endure zero-G environments.
You want to go straight there?
Let's see. Let's just go. Let's just go from here. Here you can see the cover. This is the most recent version of the published Zelda Link to the Past comic as drawn and written by Ishinomori himself.
So for those of you who had the American release, and it came with a little comic book, he drew that. Come on, man. Gambare.
With 009, the organization abducted 9 different people from different walks of life and experimented on them to modify them into cyborgs, all with different function and purpose, all again to create that one ultimate weapon, because what better way to come up with an ultimate prototype than to experiment with one idea, one gimmick, then another, then another, then another, until you have a more complete and final version. Which is interesting for their choices.
Come on. I'm sorry about this, folks.
So, and in order, the choices are interesting. 001 was an infant born with psychic powers. Imagine 11 from Stranger Things, except a baby, and instead of nosebleeds and falling unconscious, the baby just winds up super tired and needs to sleep a lot. 002 was a human gangster who was an American gangster, literally lifted from West Side Story. The idea for the character was literally lifted from a West Side Story. A gangster who gets abducted and is literally souped up to basically be a human-propelled jet. He's basically the Rocketeer, the Rocket Man. 003 was a French woman who, being a woman, meant she would have the most non-combative but the most direct and significant role. She's basically a human radar and sonar all in one. 004 can be best described as the living weapon. Ostensibly the best way, basically, imagine if he's basically Sam Worthington's character in Terminator Salvation. He was that step between human to Terminator. He basically has been modified everywhere with weapons. One hand is literally replaced with machine gun chambers. He can shoot rocket-propelled grenades out of his knees or elbows. One hand literally has a hidden hatchet. 005 is a Native American gentle giant who, per the stereotype for the longest time, is also attuned to nature, is more a pacifist by nature. He was modified to have a body of steel. 006 was a Chinese peasant farmer who winds up losing all his property. He gets converted into a human flamethrower, which ends up being useful because the said flames are hot enough to burn through rock, which basically makes him the digger, the human mole. 007, and aptly and appropriately an Englishman, has the power to transform into anything he can imagine. All he has to do is literally press a button placed on his belly button. 008 was an African, which at the time was only because of the design they used was based around a lot of what would now be very controversial designs for black characters in entertainment. But the idea was to turn him into literally a human submarine where he's fitted with an aqualung. And then, of course, there's the final character, 009 in the center, a Japanese boy who was converted to basically have a human acceleration device. He basically can move at superhuman speed. And he is a pinnacle of everything that's been built up to this point in the entire line. And then ultimately, since they all have individual abilities, they all best work together as a team. Thanks to the professor that helped create them, not knowing they were not willing test subjects, they escape Black Ghost and take the fight to stop them and their cyborg armies. So now that we have the slides working for the moment, let's consider what their plan was. Phase 1, create cyborg soldiers. Phase 2, escalate the Cold War and future conflict into space. Phase 3, Phase 4, profit. I mean, what else was there?
Sentai safe. Michelle?
It's always lonely at the top. Now the fun thing about 009 is that it's had lasting vitality. It's had 3 anime series, including one produced in 2000, which then aired here in the States on Cartoon Network. That same series is actually getting a re-release through Discotech sometime this year in full completion, something we've never had before. So this would be the best, most definitive experience of 009 you will get, because all of the older series are a little too obscure and no one has licensed them.
Hey Dan, is it true that Cyborg 009 is the precursor to teams of heroes like Power Rangers?
You could say that. In fact, especially after producing Kamen Ranger, Ishinomori got involved when Toei requested that he produce a superhero show that was about a team of heroes rather than a solitary hero. So he was involved in writing the first 2 series, Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger and Jakka Dengekitai, both of which involve a squad of cybernetic enhanced soldiers fighting against an organization of evil. But Ishinomori was only involved with these 2. The Super Sentai series would continue on its own without his involvement because it would commit to some of his other works.
Is Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger available in the US right now?
Currently, no, because Shock Factory has only been releasing Sentai series that have been adapted as Power Rangers, and there's no word on whether or not they're going to go back in time for any of that.
Keep your eyes out for these, because these are the grandparents of all of the Power Rangers. So the tropes you will find in this show will find itself repeated throughout every single iteration of the Ranger series.
Ishinomori laid the seeds for it by just having a team against an evil organization. The idea of giant monsters and giant robots was added after the fact he was no longer involved. I'll see if we can move on that. It's interesting how decades after the fact, the idea behind a team of writer-like heroes working together and being color-coded would be revisited for a spin-off in a movie years later. But these are the Kamen Sentai Go Riders, as featured in the Ultra Superhero Taisen movie, which ostensibly is the second to last of these crossovers that for some time since 2010s, Toei tried crossing over Kamen Rider and Super Sentai within one overarching universe. But as of the most recent Winter movie, their plan was to ostensibly discontinue it due to lack of ticket sales. So their priority now is to just stick with have individual movies for just Rider and Sentai. But this crossover was basically their last real attempt to flesh out what was otherwise a principal idea, a founding idea to the inspiration for what we have today.
I'd like to note, let's take a quick peek in comparison to this homage to Ishinomori's first work. Let's look back at Himitsu Sentai. And you notice the collars, and as mentioned earlier, the earrings on Momo Ranger. And, no earrings, but a lot of the same design elements were added back into the Kamen Rider costume. Going back to Skullman.
So again, here we have motifs and themes that, for example, the Skullman and certain other characters like the Skull, the leader of Black Ghost, who influenced the design of the Skullman himself, were anti-heroes or villains whose intent are always with some kind of greater cause or purpose, in a very Machiavellian sense of how their ends will justify the means in the long run. In the case of the Skullman, he has a vendetta wanting to get revenge for the murder of his family, and will use whatever means necessary, targeting anyone and everyone that he feels is in the way of his plans. On the right, that is Minami Kotaro as he appears in Kamen Rider Black RX, which was a continuation of Black, the first of its kind, as every series afterwards has always been different from each other, even though they all coexist within the same continuity back then. But like all the other writers, like so many of these characters Ishinomori has created, he struggles with his identity. He struggles with his human identity while knowing that his powers and abilities make him something other than human. This is based on an underlying feeling that was existent through the 1960s and onward, where children growing up in post-war economic miracle Japan were seen very different from the generation that grew up before and during the war. The sentiment that, what with technology and society changing the way it was back then, they're becoming something other than what most people thought where they were comfortable with or used to. Ishinomori also had a very common set of designs and aesthetics in his heroes, always wearing scarves, so to quote Edna, no capes, no capes. And there's also the aesthetic of compound, egg-shaped, or ovular eyes, typically in the design of insects or a very specific ancient culture.
Jomo.
There's another one of his works, Android Kikaider, which took its own inspiration from Pinocchio and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where we have a hero who was created as a machine that believes and exists as a man, and thus has the issue of human identity, which also comes with the issue of conscience. The key design feature in Kikaider is the morality chip, which at the time was incomplete, as his creator was murdered before his full design could be finished. And the morality chip ends up being something of a weakness before it becomes a strength, because he becomes easily corrupted by the mad scientist Dr. Gilmore, who tries to enlist him for his own nefarious cause of using an android army to take over the world. Kikaider also had an anime that was produced around the same time as the 2000 009 anime that also aired on Cartoon Network, and has had a number of spin-offs. But the most recent aesthetic, or rather the most recent production Kikaider had to date, was a remake made in 2013 that wound up being promoted in an episode of the then Kamen Rider running at the time, Kamen Rider Gain. Literally, the new version of Kikaider literally just steps in, finds himself getting caught up in a little conflict that is little more than publicity for the movie. And as for what I'm aware, it is readily available for viewership. I've seen it purchasable on Amazon. So, since I've yet to see it, I would very much highly recommend it. Only because, again, all of these works have been adapted, readapted, reinterpreted as years went on, even after the fact Ishinomori has been gone, because they have that lasting staying power as an iconic part of the pop culture legacy.
I would like to make a note that Kikaider, let's look at that Kikaider design of the face real quick. We mentioned how a lot of Ishinomori's designs are inspired by the ancient civilization of the Jomon and other prehistoric civilizations, but also, take a look at this. This is from Serbia, the Vinca culture, which mysteriously similar. All of this is like the same time period as the Jomon civilization. So they take a lot of cues from designs from these ancient cultures. You see how that helmet? And think about Star Wars and George Lucas. Doesn't that kind of make you think of Boba Fett? It's not a different shape, though. So like, some of the statues are more dramatically similar. I recommend just typing in Vinca at some point and checking out some of the different statues. Compare them to your favorite characters.
Zubat is a very interesting case. It's pretty obscure because it's not known outside of Japan, and other than for the obvious reason why it would probably be mistaken is because of its obvious name. The name, it has double meaning. Kaikets meaning resolution, resolve. Zubat is the sound for something when you throw something and it hits on the mark perfectly. In his case, the cross-shaped boomerang. And was made in the style of, it was made in the 70s, but was made in the style of a lot of older vigilante hero shows from the 1950s. The main character is basically a wandering vagabond, dresses like a bustling cowboy, but doesn't even have to transform. He literally pulls the suit out of his guitar and throws a boomerang and flies around in a rocket car.
I wonder personally if He watched some of the cartoons in the US, such as
Quick Draw McGraw's El Kabong.
El Cabal. Yes.
Maybe the Jetsons.
And here's a clip.
This is the opening, just to give you an example. Zubat also notably broke a norm that Ishinomori helped establish. As you will have seen with Kamen Rider and Kikaider, he helped innovate the transforming superhero, which was a trope that really wasn't too easily adapted because Kamen Rider wasn't the first. He was just the one to pioneer the idea because Ishinomori just took the idea, ran with it in a way that was better than what came before it. Especially by trademarking the phrase henshin, which in fact has a very interesting reason for its application. And that's because, interestingly enough, henshin, or transformation in Japanese, is also the Japanese transliteration of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. And what's Metamorphosis about? A man transforms into a bug. And here we have...
Oh, I want to remind you again about Vinca and Jomon Civilization. Check out that robot face. Very Vinca, just saying.
Robot Keiji, or detective, made in the style of a detective show, also a bit different from Ishinomori's heroes. He's just a robot. He's just a robot in human clothes. He doesn't transform. He doesn't have to do anything to change, per se. He goes around traveling, solving cases. And he, alongside Kikaider, would help innovate a genre that Ishinomori did not even have a hand in. But these characters would help set the standard for the Metal Heroes series, a sub-series of superheroes that usually don a metal suit and fight crime, much in the way of detectives or police. And you may not know this, but anyone who's played a lot of video games may know that Robot Keiji did in fact design a very specific character of interest that I discovered.
Oh yeah, cute.
Is this a clip?
Yes. Just you can play some of the first few seconds to skip like the first 10 or so. Some of the mannerisms of Q from Street Fighter 3 were very much lifted from Robot Keiji. If anything, it also just proves how, again, the key influence, how Ishinomori's work has been an influence for a lot of medium, even well after the fact he's been gone. It's that staying power of his work.
That should give you an idea.
And now for another fun example, I thought I'd at least show you some certain designs that may be familiar from current and very popular anime for the longest time. On the left, you have characters unwillingly made into a Sentai team, the Color Rangers from the short series Level E, available through Funimation Entertainment. And on the right, you have a more obvious design, the Great Saiyaman.
Who is a reference to Riderman, I believe.
Yes, there was a character introduced in the second Kamen Rider TV series who is a rider, yet is not a rider, because he was never fully modified, and instead he simply puts on a mask that only covers his eyes, not his whole face. Hence, Rider Man.
And the Ginyu Force were based on the Rangers.
Yes. And some other designs that may be a bit more obvious. Genji's design would obviously, the costume itself is called Sentai, but it obviously takes use from Kamen Rider, particularly Kamen Rider Z-Cross, who was the 10th Rider and was designed to be a cyborg ninja. Another design that I didn't think to feature though, Gray Fox in Metal Gear Solid, who again is subjected to cybernetic experiments. You also have a lot of these summons from Yu-Gi-Oh! And then of course there's Digimon that have at least a few Rider or Tokusatsu inspired designs, the most obvious here being Stingmon. More recently, Pop Team Epic, in all of its dank shitpost references, eventually found an excuse to have Pococo apparently be an android. Instead of being, when checking for doping, they instead find something that much weirder. And then for another example that is underappreciated is Samurai Flamenco, which is a series that throws a lot of tropes onto its head in terms of tokusatsu and just takes it in one weird direction after another.
There is some boys' romance, but don't let that deter you. It's a fabulous show. I will be watching once every few years.
The main character is basically, he's a model, but he's also a die-hard tokusatsu fan. Part of his apartment is literally a hidden vault of collectible items. He spends his free time wanting to be a vigilante hero, and he eventually finds himself doing a whole lot more things than he ever thought he would ever get to do, which I always thought was a great send-up to Ishinomori's work. Then there was the matter of succession. By the 90s, Ishinomori's health was beginning to fail him, so he made a very interesting choice. He personally contacted a young up-and-coming artist, Shimamoto Kazuhiko, who he had known to have been a fan of his work. He requested and pitched ideas to readapt the Skullman as a more extensive story, because originally it was only a single volume. He took it and as a great blessing and endorsement, because Ishinomori had been one of his idols and it helped inspire a lot of his work in the future. On the right you see the first volume, which again is, although out of print, you could still find it if you try. On the left you have Shimamoto's own take on 009.
I've never heard of manga scans.
And here are some Shimamoto designs that could easily be drawing cues from Ishinomori's work. The most obvious was design of characters from Mobile Fighter G Gundam, characters from the very underappreciated Capcom fighting game Rival Schools.
With an Ishinomori reference character in there?
Yes, there's a character in a bike suit with a skull design, evocative of the Skullman. There's also Skullomania in Street Fighter EX, even though that's not really a fully official Capcom. And on the bottom right you have what is actually a very interesting story here I'm about to get into. But one of Shimamoto's early works in manga was Blazing Exchange Student, which is literally an exchange student who enters high school and finds himself picking fights with the entire school. Might sound familiar for an anime that came out a couple years ago in the form of Kill la Kill. But the interesting thing about Blazing Exchange Student was that it was one of the first productions adapted by to be animated by the then new Studio Gainax, of which there's another interesting history. Shimamoto eventually drew a manga that was a fictionalized dramatization of his college life at an art school in Osaka, where he was in fact classmates with future founders of Studio Gainax, including his self-declared rival, Anno Hideaki, on the right. But just as a fun little game, can you pick out which character is supposed to be Shimamoto?
No, not at all.
Well, if you think of his if you think of his design motif of hot-headed, hot-blooded, passionate heroes who are evocative of old heroes from the 60s and 70s.
Spicy. Fire.
It's the character with the black hair and the style of old anime heroes, and obviously the flame designs on his shirt, but the character's name is Hono Moyuru, literally means burning fire. This is from a manga called Aoi Hono, literally blue fire, which is available on a separate streaming service. I can't recall the name, but it's on Wikipedia. But You can otherwise find it subbed under the title Blue Blazes. There is in fact a live drama adaptation of the manga, of which in fact Shimamoto cameos in an episode. I won't spoil it, but it's really interesting when you get to that point. And
Get that name
Shimamoto Kazuhiko.
in the show.
Blue Blazes, Aoi Hono. If you look up the Wikipedia for this, it does. There's a streaming service that is neither Netflix or Amazon. I think it's like it's got V's and I's. Finally, Ishinomori died of heart failure in 1998, only a few days after what was would have been his 60th birthday. A lot of his work he had planned had to be put on ice for the longest time by the studio and the production companies until 2 years later, Kamen Rider Krugo would launch with some base ideas left behind by Ishinomori. A year after that series aired, a museum was built in his honor in his hometown, now called Ishinomaki, which lies on the coast of Miyagi Prefecture and faces a very famous island that is known where its cat population outnumbers the human population. It's quite a tourist attraction.
So, check out Cat Island, and check out the museum. And food in Miyagi Prefecture is pretty good too.
This is a work of art that can actually be seen on Ishinomori's grave as a way to commemorate and honor his entire collective pantheon of all of his characters, all of his designs, all of which were this indelible legacy in Japanese pop culture. And again, as I say to this day, his reputation being equatable to the likes of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko just shows you the kind of reputation he has that is, as I said, criminally underappreciated because a lot of this work has not made a lot of coverage stateside outside of some of the spin-offs and adaptations of 009 or some other works.
Gilgamesh.
Or largely works that are inspired by Ishinomori's legacy.
The best example I can give right now is that Funimation licensed the Re-Cyborg 009 movie, which imagines the team in a post-war on terror world. And then only about 2 years ago, a 3-episode OVA series launched and released internationally on Netflix as an incredible crossover between 009 and Go Nagai's Devilman, because interestingly enough, Go Nagai himself was a brief understudy of Ishinomori. Although that partnership didn't last as long because soon enough he had a job offer that he just latched onto and his whole career just skyrocketed in a way that while their partnership was short, it left an indelible legacy. So there's a thought too. Aside from the likes of Shimamoto, there's also Go Nagai who would have taken some of what he learned from Ishinomori. Which of course you can now see with some of this. It also feels like a great precursor because 009 versus Devilman predates Devilman Crybaby, which is also on Netflix. But the other title I find worth mentioning would be 009 Call of Justice, which was a three-part film series that then got spliced into 12 episodes on Netflix. Which again, this is though a post-Ishinomori production that how well it stands on its own is ultimately up to you, especially if you familiarize yourself with his work. But the most important note I want to leave you with is that if you want to read any of his work, it is now available on Comixology, which from what I'm aware is now assimilated within Amazon. So if you ever wanted to check out some of his works like Kaider, Kamen Rider, 009, it's all there. And even any of the spin-offs based on him are good because they're always being done in the spirit of what Ishinomori would have designed. So since that is pretty much the end of this presentation, I'd like to open the floor to comments or questions.
Wasn't Inazuman made by Ishinomori too?
Yes, I failed to mention it this time around because Inazuman is definitely one of the more obscure entries, but it's a fine example of how Ishinomori's trope of humans becoming something inhuman, something beyond humanity, is exactly what Inazuman is.
Who also reappeared in Wizard, was it? The Wizard movie?
I believe so, yes. Though another example would be that there was a movie, for the 40th anniversary of Kamen Rider, the then running series O's had a movie that, aside from featuring every Kamen Rider then to date, fighting it out with a collective cabal of villains, One of them literally tries to make off on a good escape, but finds himself surrounded and ultimately cornered by Ishinomori's non-rider heroes, including the likes of Kikaider, Inazuman, and Zubat. So if you look for the O's Rider Let's Go movie, you can check out this very brief cameo that's literally a tip of the hat to these characters who've basically gone on so long without an adaptation because their works have not continued as long as, say, Sentai or Rider.
Isn't there another anime came out, Female Spy or something?
Yes, 0091 was a reinterpretation of 009, but with all the characters being basically these female secret agents, which the setting was Cold War, which was perfect for its time because that's when it would have been made.
Inazuman is also on Comixology. Check it out.
And more importantly, as I mentioned before, Discotech plans to re-salvage the license for the 2000 009 anime, which I'd highly recommend. It is probably the most definitive experience we would have of it because the older series are a bit harder to access, but would still be worth checking out if you can find them.
Isn't it the most accurate adaptation?
Yes, there were a few additions. Like there was an anti-hero made in the style of Ishinomori's character 0013, who was a late addition to a late original addition to the anime. And certain arcs had to be slightly changed and reinterpreted because of creative license. Because at the time, Ishinomori went back and forth on a lot of his different works to the point that he would work on 009, he then took a break and worked on something else, so he would sometimes go back to it because of the way the publishing worked back then. Which is why, although one arc even went unresolved because of course he passed away. I think that about wraps it up. But thank you all for coming. I hope that learning about this creator has been as enjoyable an experience as it was for me to present it, because as I mentioned, he is underrated, underappreciated, and doesn't get nearly enough coverage that he deserves, considering his mark on Japan's pop cultural legacy. Thank you very much for coming.